Hey, what's happening, my people? We are live once again, another edition of Boxing History Every Night, where we talk about boxing history. That's the actual subject of it. No lie, I just got through listening to Conway the Machine, Millennial Nights Part 1. Man, it's got me amped, ready to go, baby. So we're gonna keep this thing going, kick it off. It's gonna be right. So appreciate anyone and everyone who jumps in and watches this here live, as well as those who end up ultimately watching it via the replay. But I want to thank all just in general because, as mentioned, the sport of boxing and the history remains live and well. And when we think about boxing, it does have one of the largest, just overall histories as it relates to just sports in general, in terms of one of the deepest. It goes back, way back, and that's kind of what we want to, or like to talk about at the very least, is the history that dates way back to times in which technology was very much different, or a different state of things. But that being said, it's history nonetheless. So thank you all for being here. As mentioned, those that will be listening as well. So you've seen the title. The title in itself is in reference to none other than the greatest fighter to ever live, or at least according to certain standards, the Boston Bone Crusher, Sam Langford. Now, people might have their own particular differences, thoughts, and feelings surrounding who is the greatest of all time. And you have that right. You certainly have that right. That's one of the things that makes boxing what it is. We rely and thrive on sort of fantasy fights, the notion of certain individuals having a particular placement in the history of the sport, that coupled with it running deep. So you have the right to have who you want as the greatest of all time, just like any other sport. You have the Jordans, LeBrons, you have the Barry Sanders, Walter Paytons, etc., etc. In boxing, we have a good mixture of very much that same thing right there. But for the most part, Sam Langford is one of the preeminent fighters in the history of the sport. I mean, if you look at it from a resume standpoint, there's really none that gets deeper except for one, Harry Greb, that is the Pittsburgh Windmill. Is probably the one that can rival Langford in some capacity. And there's degrees of separation there that may lend you to thinking or siding with Langford being the greatest resume, as is the situation if you're thinking that Harry Greb has the greatest resume. So no wrong answer, really. It's all about dialogue. That's how the boxing history stays where it's at. It's via and through dialogue. So with that in mind, we're just going to dive into some of the things surrounding the actual fighter that was Sam Langford. Now, I just recently released a video on the channel. It's in regards to Sam Langford specifically. And if you go through that video, you'll see that there are 7 names listed in terms of those names that put him in that caliber above what the majority of boxers have experienced in the sport, and these are world champions that he ended up facing. And the significance of it is the fact that these world champions scaled across multiple weight classes. So, and another thing to keep in mind as well is we are now here in modern times in the multi-belt era, the multi-division era, in the sense of it's not just the original weight classes. We have these in-between weight classes. So you'll see things such as this person is a whatever division world champion, 5 division world champion, 4 division world champion. But back in these days, back in the days of Sam Langford, etc., you didn't have those options out there because there were no in-between weights. If you were a middleweight, the next step was light heavyweight, not super middleweight. If you were light heavyweight, the next step was heavyweight, not cruiserweight. So those are the type of things you have to factor in when thinking about just the history and a fighter like Sam Langford, especially compared to modern times. But those are the things we're going to dive into here for sure. So I want to send a shout out to everyone. Again, 86 Boxing. We are here. We are live. Be sure to like, subscribe. I have a special guest, of course, in the building as well. Since we're talking Sam Langford, my man, Random Acoustic Thoughts, is here in the mix. And he is here to help digest and dive through this resume that is Sam Langford. So I'll have a depiction that shows you some of the different fighters, each of these champions that Langford faced, these world champions that he faced, their resumes and who they ultimately went up against us from a notability standpoint. It won't include every fight that they ended up facing that would be considered a notable fighter, but certainly enough where you get an understanding, you get a kind of definition of just how great Sam Langford was. And I think you'll benefit from it. And I challenge you, you can call it homework, whatever it may be, to go look up some of these fighters and go look at how their resumes translate, especially as it relates to modern times. And we think about the champions, the names, etc. A lot of these individuals, I mean, it's the cream of the crop for the most part. And in the video that I released, I didn't even include every fighter that he faced that could be considered in that same echelon, because there are some that never got a shot at a world title who are better than some of those that did actually hold the world title, and that's a story for another day. But that being said, we'll jump into that a little bit as well. So with that, I just wanted to give an introduction to my man, Random Acoustic Thoughts. Appreciate you there, Random. Thank you for dropping by. It's always great to have you in here. And especially when we're discussing Sam Langford, the Boston Bone Crusher. And you can feel free to share any sort of introductory thoughts you may have on Langford there, Random, because he is certainly one that it's a name that rings bells when it relates to boxing history. But there's still a number of people out there, a number of sort of casual and other fans who probably just don't know how good he was, And that's what we want to kind of present here tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, 86. I hope you're having a good night, my friend.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Yeah, it's always fun discussing this crazy career. Yeah, Langford just had a ridiculous, sustained level of opposition in his career. And even like very, very late in his career when he's fighting with one eye and he's mostly blind in the other, he's still fighting a ton of fights, even when the opposition levels dropped a little bit. And sometimes you still have great fighters in there. One of the guys we're going to talk about, this was a run of mostly fights against lesser fighters, but he still got in there, and it was actually one of his last great wins. So yeah, Langford's career is crazy. You picked a nice sampling. Like you said, some of the opponents that could have been on the list maybe even were more accomplished as boxers as far as their resumes, but these were all important fighters. You got to make decisions. It's just too big of a career to do in one live stream to do it any justice. You know that.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So no, I appreciate that, Random. And that's one of the things I was thinking about. So when you look at the video that I released on the channel, it was intentional in that I only focused on the champions, and I didn't even get deep into the champions' careers. I really just kind of gave you a few liners related to their fight with Sam Langford. But as far as resumes, one of the absolute deepest resumes in history is Sam Langford. And when you're talking 300 plus fights, trust me, it's hard to kind of narrow that down in a single setting, because you run into several situations in which you see these names that may be casual to some, but are known for those that go through sort of the research process, and you don't want to exclude them. And that's what makes it tricky from an overall perspective. And Sam Langford is one of those guys who just so happens to have kind of that type of resume and the type of opponents that he ended up going up against. Real quick here, Brandon, I want to shout out to Johnny 5, LBC 213. Salute there to you, Johnny. Appreciate you dropping by there, buddy. He says, keep up the great work, brother. I enjoy your content. Hey, I appreciate you, Johnny. No problem at all. Salute to you. I appreciate you actually dropping by, showing some love there for sure. And shout out to USC. I'm a New Orleans Saints fan, and that's because of USC alum Reggie Bush right there. You know what I'm saying? So shout out to USC there. See your profile picture, but no, good stuff there. But yeah, again here, 86 Boxing, Random Acoustic Thoughts. Be sure to like, subscribe if you can. We appreciate it. Be sure to like and subscribe to Random Acoustic Thoughts channel as well, because he has a lot of good historic content that dives deeper into Sam Langford than what I've done here on the 86 Boxing channel. So that's why I recommend. And if you've seen the video, you'll know that I recommended Random Acoustic Thoughts, because if you want that Langford history, he's the man for it for sure. So with that, Random, yeah, we're going to be jumping into Sam Langford. And I want to start with one of his actual early opponents. He was a champion in the lightweight division, and he's one of the greatest fighters that ever lived there, Random. And it just so happens Sam Langford, which I tell you, the brevity of his career, this the science behind it. Sam Langford actually fought him. It's the old master Joe Gans. Now, this is a former world lightweight champion who is one of the most formidable champions in the history of the sport. And the ironic thing, and we'll certainly get to the heavyweight portion of it, is that Langford is most associated with the heavyweight division, but he actually started lightweight, Nova Scotia, Canada. Sam Langford, she started in the lightweight division. This started in the AAU. And one of the opponents early on that he went up against was just so happened to be the world lightweight champion, Joe Gans. And I'm going to pull up an actual depiction here that shows you some of the notable opponents for Gans as well. But it just shows you just the level of competition we're talking about here. Random, I want to give you an opportunity to just kind of speak to that fight, and then we can kind of look into sort of the resume aspect of it as well. But speak to that fight with Joe Gans and Sam Langford, which I know you've chronicled on your channel, and it's certainly one that stands the test of time when you look at it from an overall standpoint there, Random. So appreciate you.
Yeah, this is a win that for Langford, this aged like wine, because, Gans had already had a great career when he won the lightweight, like universal acclaim as lightweight champion, May 12th, 1902, when he stopped Frank Earn in 100 seconds, stopped him. He held that title until 1908, July 4th, 1908, when he lost it to Battling Nelson, who he'd already beaten by then. But he lost in the 17th round of a Schedule 45. So Langford beating him at the end of 1903, when Gans had already had a great career, but he had a lot of great things he would do after that. So even as Langford sort of climbed the weights, 1904 and beyond, that win still resonated out. And even many years later, when Langford was an old heavyweight, half blind, and sometimes the writers have to remind readers that it was in fact the same Langford who beat Gans at the Criterion Club back in 03. We could call this Langford's first great win. He'd had some great performances, but this was his first really legendary opponent, and beat him on points over 15 rounds at the premier club of the time in Boston, the Criterion Club, which today is actually the Boston Center for the Arts, 541 Tremont Street. So the old building is still there behind sort of the new facing that's been built on the building. I ushered a play in that building. And in later years, that would actually be the Armory, where Langford would fight many times in subsequent seasons. But this win was phenomenal. And Gans had a few newspaper decision setbacks in his whole run as champion, but the only points loss he got in that whole time in all those years was against Langford, from when he'd won the title to when he lost it to Battling Nelson. So this really was special, even though Jack Blackburn and a couple of guys, Jack Blackburn, I think Willie Fitzgerald maybe, or Willie Lewis gotten the best of him in newspaper decisions in shorter fights. But this was a win-win. And they fought a catch weights. Langford was 140. I think Gans weighed in just over 135. The allowance was up to 138, which was actually 5 pounds over the official limit at the time, but that was a common thing. It was happening down at featherweight. Young Corbett was defending above the featherweight limit fighting at 128, 130, even though 122 was the recognized limit. There was no commission, so things were a little bit malleable, but Langford actually came in a little bit over the agreed weight where he could win the title. So even though he didn't get the title, but he did put himself into international prominence with that win.
Now, those stipulations kind of came in last minute, right? So for Langford, he had to try and run off this weight.
Well, to my understanding, it was booked on about a week's notice. So he issued the challenge, posted the forfeit, and then like just about a week later, they were fighting. And I'm not sure about last minute changes, but he was running all day, the day of the fight. Gans had actually had a 6-round bout against Dave Hawley of Philadelphia in Philly the day before. So Gans wasn't in perfect shape. He took some good body shots in that fight. But Langford had actually been running all day trying to strip off the last pounds because he had $200 in forfeit money. He didn't want to lose a good bit of money for a beginning fighter. $200 that he ended up losing for not making the weight. And then also, obviously, the title didn't change hands. But the acclaim did absolutely rub off on Langford. And he was celebrated for this, I mean, just forever, perpetually. This was a win that aged beautifully for him. But yeah, he did. It was some adversity. He didn't get like a big prep time. He didn't have 4 months to get ready. So he had to shed the weight because probably by this time he might have been walking around 145 or something. I'm not sure. But he did have to train down. He just didn't have a lot of time to do so. But
okay.
Yeah. They had a real battle in there. Gans was a genius. And this was just something that resonated on throughout his career, even when he was up middleweight and beyond.
Good to go there, Random. And so in the actual Langford video that I released, you'll see me mention it. I mentioned the stipulations. You're getting it clear in here from Random Acoustic Thoughts, as he just mentioned. It was about a week's notice. I didn't mention that in the video. I mentioned stipulation, certainly, that attributed to him trying to work off that weight. But yeah, you think about it from a week standpoint, a week to drop a certain amount of pounds. Yeah, that can be tough under any circumstances, just from an overall perspective. But you get that clarity here. That's why I'm happy to have Random Acoustic Thoughts here, who has dove deep into the history of Sam Langford, and from that perspective, providing and shedding light on that. And real quick, just so you understand, and I'm going to go through some of these names right here, just so you understand how good Joe Gans was. But you look at the likes of a young Griffo, I believe the world featherweight champion at one point, Bobby Dobbs, who is one of the premier fighters who fought in and around that lightweight limit and continued to move up and do his thing in the sport. Never got a shot at the world title, but would have been one of those guys that could have competed in any era. I mentioned Kate McPartland because he was a very good fighter and he fought some tough competition in the sport in itself. Frank Aaron, he is the person that Joe Gans defeated to win the world lightweight championship. And he's out of Norway, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I think he's Norwegian right there. And one of the best fighters, just when we think about that particular period, fighting in and around that lightweight limit. And he held the title. Joe Gans was able to accomplish such. They had fought prior to that. So I think he got either a draw or a win over Joe Gans. I mentioned Joe Grimm, but that's more so for sort of folklore, novelty type preferences, because there's a video on the channel of Joe Grimm where he's one of these guys who was just outerworldly, could take a ton of sustained punishment, and he ended up fighting Joe Gans. Joe Gans couldn't knock him out. That was one of the things. Joe Grimm was the type of fighter, he had over 100 plus fights, and he couldn't be stopped. He was stopped once. That being said, Joe Gans wasn't able to do it, and we know how formidable he was. Sam Bolin, another one of those fighters who doesn't have that name perspective, but he is one who was a very formidable fighter during this particular time, just right there contending, the type of fighter that you went up against and you learn in the process. Battling Nelson, of course, former world lightweight champion, and Joe Gans was able to defeat him. And it was one of the fights that is actually out there on film, one of the great fights that we do have on film, 42 rounds or essentially 41 rounds, and then there was a low blow on the end of Nelson that ultimately allowed Joe Gans to go with the victory, but the two would fight subsequently as well. Harry Lewis, there's a video on the channel on Harry Lewis, former world welterweight champion, tough fighter out of Philly, Jewish fighter, had a deep resume as well. He was actually the first fighter charged with manslaughter because of an in-ring death. So it's crazy. And check out that video. You'll learn a little bit more. Then I'm going up to the top here. Jack Blackburn. He is one of the great fighters and trainers of the sport. As far as his fighting career, he probably deserves to be in the Hall of Fame on that alone. He had to win over Joe Gans, who we're talking about here, the old master. I mean, he was in with the likes of him, from Joe Gans to Harry Greb. Just think about that. Joe Gans, Harry Greb. That in itself tells you everything you need to know about the type and caliber of fighter Jack Blackburn was. Not to mention, he went on to train world champions such as Joe Louis, as well as Sammy Mandel. So take a look at Jack Blackburn. There's a video on the channel, just as there is a video of George Elbows McFadden on the channel as well, who was another lightweight who was very formidable in his time, never won a world title. And as a matter of fact, he actually fought Joe Gans multiple times. So check out some of the Joe Gans videos on the channel or the George McFadden video, and you'll get more of an understanding of there. Terrible Terry McGovern. Excuse me. This is a fighter who was the world featherweight champion who beat Joe Gans in what was considered to be a fixed fight. And looking at the video, you know, I kind of lean towards that direction myself there personally, though some have differing opinions of such. But it's definitely one that you need to see for yourself. On the channel, there is a video of Terry McGovern. It gets into that a little bit. It's one of the earlier videos, so you'll probably need to do some even deeper research. But there is video of that fight actually taking place, or at least that sequence in which this knockout occurs. And you can judge for yourself, certainly based on some of the other Gans fights that are out there. Willie Fitzgerald, top-level contender from that time. Someone who was actually competing against, or at least intending to fight, Jack Dillon. I'm reading the Jack Dillon book that Mark Allen Baker just recently released, and that was a fight that was scheduled right there. Jack Dillon, the Hoosier Bearcat, the Giant Slayer. So I know a little bit about Fitzgerald. We'll jump into him more as I continue to dive into his career a bit. Of course, Dave Holly, not unlike Sam Bolin, Bobby Dobbs, one of these black fighters who didn't have that name notoriety, or at least don't have it here in this day. But if you look at what they were able to do for their time, they were some of the most formidable. Same with Dave Holly. This is a guy who was in there multiple times with the likes of Sam Langford, etc. That just gives you kind of just an understanding of how tough a type of guy like that is. Barbados Joe Walcott, former world welterweight champion, who we'll get to. He was in there with Joe Gans. Of course, he was in there with Sam Langford. And then Mike Twin Sullivan, one of the Sullivan twins. This was a former world welterweight champion who ultimately stepped in the ring with a number of top-level competition and proved himself to be a standout during that era. So he was in there with Gans. He was in there with some others that we've mentioned as well. Then, of course, Kid Herman, who's a contender from the time, who actually fought Joe Gans. We have video of that fight. If you look up Joe Gans versus Kid Herman, then you'll get to see one of the greatest knockouts in the sport that we've seen, because Kid Herman ultimately gets caught with a special shot. It was like a right hook as he was essentially kind of stepping in a little bit. He was trying to duck, got caught with a light hook or a right hook, and it was all she wrote. And it took him about 30 minutes to be revived, just overall in general. And it's one of those that stands the test of time. There's video of that out there, so I recommend going to check that out. So that kind of shows you the depth and breadth of which Joe Gans was able to operate there, Random, and it's pretty crazy just thinking about that in some of those names that were mentioned on that resume, some of whom will come up here again.
Yeah, and that's not even it for Gans. I mean, Jimmy Britt, there are other guys in there who are notable in their day that got in there. But I mean, again, Gans is another resume. You got to pick and choose, you know? It
Oh
really
yeah.
is that big. Huge amount of fights. I think he had almost 200 fights that we know about, maybe some in private that we don't. But yeah, just one of the all-time great fighters, and a fighter who was celebrated later by great fighters. So his name, people who were around to see Gans, who were later around to see, the great lightweights of future times, and some of the welterweights, because Gans wasn't afraid to fight above his weight. In fact, like as you mentioned, he fought the great Barbados Walcott. That was like the end of September 1904, the Walcott's last fight before he got injured. And they had a great fight over in San Francisco, a 20-round fight that went to a draw. A non-title fight, but I believe that was the first time in California two reigning champions have fought each other in the ring in California. But it was a non-title fight. And they fought at 141, just a pound below the limit, the welterweight limit. But yeah, and Gans said the Walcott, I know we're going to talk about Walcott, but yeah, Gans said Walcott had the hardest punches of anyone he fought, even though he didn't hurt him in the fight, he claimed. He said Walcott had the heaviest punches. Walcott was something special, man. That guy was a little terror.
Yeah, Joe Walcott, 5'1", a stocky individual with power. He had a punch. He had a mix of pretty much everything. As a matter of fact, that's who we're getting to next here, Random. As a matter of fact, it is Barbados Joe Walcott, not to be confused with Jersey Joe Walcott, because Jersey Joe Walcott was a world heavyweight champion. You probably know him from Rocky Marciano, etc. But that being said, he took his namesake from Barbados Joe Walcott, who's this 5'1", just a hell of a fighter who can knock out heavyweights. He knocked out Joe Chowinski, to name one, of course. And he started in the lower weights, of course, and just continued to rise up. Back then, it was nothing to step up and face a fighter who was much bigger than you. And that was the case there with Barbados Joe Walcott. And he just so happens to be someone who was the world welterweight champion at the time that Sam Langford faced him, which is amazing in itself right there. So I'm going to pull up this depiction so you can see some of the names that are tied to Barbados Joe Walcott. And before I dive into those, of course, he faced Sam Langford. And just think about that. Two big punchers, two guys who were known to be very much a force in the sport of boxing. And this went down at welterweight. Again, Sam Langford is most associated with heavyweight, but this went down at welterweight, which kind of gives you the breadth of his ability to kind of scale the divisions, and not only that, but keep the power associated with him. And this was a fight that, depending on how you want to categorize it, you can consider it controversial. If you look at the video that I posted, then I'll mention on there that Sam Langford was able to outpoint Barbados Joe Walcott, but he wasn't necessarily the aggressor. He did it from more of a defensive standpoint, and that's something I consulted with Random Acoustic Thoughts on beforehand, and I'm sure he can provide some additional insight to that. So, Random, just from your perspective and what you've researched and all of that stuff, kind of break down that fight in particular where where Sam Langford went up against Barbados Joe Walcott, the Barbados Demon, and how it ultimately ended up being a draw.
Yeah, so they went 15 rounds at Lake Massabesic Coliseum in New Hampshire, Manchester, New Hampshire, I believe. And ref Owen Kenny, at the end of the fight, he said Walcott's aggression offset the edge on points that Langford had built. And that was the same thing that a different referee thought when Walcott and Joe Gans fought out in San Francisco, that Walcott's aggression offset being outpointed slightly. So in these days, a draw was much more prevalent than we see today. So, and it's a ref's decision. So there's no panel of judges. The ref is the judge. And but Langford did. I think he put Walcott down on one knee at one point in the fight. But they had quite a battle. and the ref deemed it even, so they split the money. It was going to be 60-40, winner loser of the fighter's share, and but it ended up splitting even because of the draw. But it put Langford even more heavily on the map, because fighting even with Barbados Walcott so early in Langford's career was considered quite an achievement. He wasn't a favorite going in. He had supporters, but a lot of people thought Walcott would, if Walcott was in good form, which he often was, that he should get it done inside the distance. It wasn't the case. And Langford sort of busted his lip open a little bit. You know, he was bleeding, and Langford apparently wasn't really marked up at all. And yeah, in the years future, well, in the months ahead, when Walcott had the hand injury and the white welterweights were drawing the color line, you know, the fact that Langford had beaten Gans and drawn with Walcott, who had drawn with Gans, sort of when they were trying to figure out who to acclaim as welterweight champion, Langford certainly was making an argument, and he claimed late in the year, he claimed the American welterweight title. He basically just posted a forfeit and said, "Okay, come and take that claim away from me." But a lot of the welterweights just didn't want to know after Walcott got hurt. Until he got hurt, actually, a lot of them were calling out Langford. Langford fought Dave Hawley, who you mentioned, the day before Gans and Walcott fought. And the winner of that was supposed to fight the winner of the other, and then everyone went to a draw, and then Walcott got hurt, and it became a mess. But until Walcott got hurt, everyone wanted to fight the winner of Hawley and Langford. They wanted to get that, be in line for the next title shot. Then once Walcott was out, people started making excuses, and that was partly what prompted Langford to start climbing the weights in 1905, you know, late 1904, 1905, when he started looking at the higher weight classes to get some matchups, because some of the guys didn't seem eager to fight him. Honey Melody was one. There were some other guys, you know, it didn't seem as appealing when there was no direct route to Walcott because he was out with a hand injury. But this aged beautifully. Again, this performance aged just wonderfully. And Joe the Giant Killer Walcott was famous for climbing the weights. He was so feared by a lot of his fellow welterweights that he would fight above his natural size and did very well that way. Even up at heavyweight, he was a factor. And at one point, Walcott himself, just like Langford later, had an open weight challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Basically wanted to fight any of the heavyweights and put some money up behind that sentiment. That's something Langford did later, that both of these men were like triangles of muscle, but Langford sort of grew into a larger version of Joe Walcott. But they had a similar temperament. They were some fiery, go-get-it type guys in the ring. Even though Langford could fight on the defensive, but he proved even in some of his losses, even one that we'll get to, that he had a lot of pluck. He was a willing fella in the ring. You know, he wasn't afraid to mix it up and go after people who were bigger than him. But sometimes against certain styles, he would fight also on the defensive. He had that option because he had a lot of finesse, even though he was a hard hitter with a good chin as well.
Oh, yeah. That's, hey, I mean, that speaks volumes about both of these guys. Real quick, I'm going to shout out to my man, Boz Bass Notes in here. Salute Josh and Random. Appreciate you there, Boz. Check us out on Boxing Chit on Sundays, 11 a.m. I missed this last one, but Boz held it down there for sure. So salute there to you, Boz. Appreciate you dropping by. Be sure to go follow him, folks. He has Boz's Boxing, but he's in the Bass Notes right now. I don't know why, but Boz Boxing. Go subscribe to that for sure. Shout out to the Final Boss right here. Appreciate you, Final Boss. He says, big up Random in 86. So Final Boss, man, hey, appreciate you. Be sure to go check him out, folks. Like, subscribe as well. Astute to the history. Always make some good suggestions out there. And I'll listen to you there, Final Boss. I do listen to you, just so you know. And more to come for sure. Final Boss says Langford was a once-in-a-century fighter. Remarkable. No doubt about it there, Final Boss. Certainly once in a century. It doesn't get much better than Sam Langford right there. And it's been well over 100 years now as far as when he was competing. Define Irony. Salute there to you, Define Irony. Says, salute and God bless. I appreciate you, fellas. You learn so much in this channel. And it's amazing. Hey, appreciate you there. Hey, appreciate those words. Take it to heart there for sure. We truly appreciate that, no doubt. We're here to talk and dialogue about boxing history. Those that understand, love, want to know more about, may not even have an understanding. That's what we're here for. We're going to be discussing some of these great fighters from those periods far beyond where we are now. Shout out to Rodolfo Rivera Jr. Be sure to go check out Rodolfo Rivera Jr. there, my buddy right there. Appreciate you, Rodolfo, dropping by per usual. It's always great having you in the mix here for sure. And also shout out to Rock Chalk True Crime. She says cheers. Cheers to you as well there, Rock Chalk. Rock Chalk, she does true crime, investigation, etc. on her channel. Be sure to go check her out. Give her a like, subscribe, and give us one while you're here right now. As a matter of fact, 86 Boxing, we're talking Sam Langford. There was a Sam Langford video that was just recently dropped on the channel. If you haven't, go check that out. Matter of fact, you can go check that out right now. This is live, but it is being recorded. Go check out that video on Sam Langford because we're talking about some of the opponents that he faced right here, right now. We were just talking the great Barbados Joe Walcott, folks, not Jersey Joe Walcott. And he was a great fighter, world heavyweight champion, but Barbados Joe Walcott, even greater there. World welterweight champion, as a matter of fact, the first. And with that in mind, as a matter of fact, there, I just want to jump into just some of the names on Barbados Joe's resume real quick. You see Joe Gans, of course, who we were talking about earlier. Tommy West, top caliber lightweight from that period, had some great fights. He fought for a world title. Can't remember exactly who it was against at that particular time. Billy Smith, I'm just going down the line from the left, and then I'm going to go to the right. Mysterious Billy Smith, that is, former world welterweight champion, one of the great fighters from the 1800s there. Very enigmatic, erratic in some sense as well, you can say, because he had a lot of disqualifications. There's a video on the channel that dives into him. Bobby Dobbs, who we were talking about earlier, can contend in any era, regardless of where you place him in terms of year. He's just one of those type of fighters. Dan Creedon, I added Dan Creedon, who Joe Walcott went up against, because of the fact that Dan Creedon, he actually fought the great Tommy Ryan for the world welterweight title. I believe it was a welterweight title at that time, in one of the longest fights in history. It was like 7+ hours. Now, Creedon came up on the short end of it, but hey, he put up a hell of a fight. I will give him that. I think it was under London prize ring. Well, you know what? There's a video on the channel on Tommy Ryan. I'll have to double check that. I can't remember for sure off top. Yeah, as a matter of fact, Jack Bonner, he's another one of those great fighters who was from this particular period, who was not a huge guy, but he fought up to heavyweight. And if you look at Jack Bonner's resume, I mean, some of the best names you can expect from the heavyweight division are certainly going to be on there. Jack freaking Bonner, go check him out, folks. He has one of those little military kind of high and tie type haircuts. So check him out. Peter Jackson. This is young Peter Jackson, who took his namesake from the great Black Prince Peter Jackson, who was a heavyweight who was contending and competing and should have fought John L. Sullivan. But young Peter Jackson, one of the most formidable fighters in the sport. Small guy, but man, he could bang like the best of them. Not unlike the Barbados Demon here, who we're showing. Honey Melody, he is someone who was a true contender in the sport and ultimately a world welterweight champion. He was the man who dethroned Barbados Joe Walcott. Not a huge name from an overall standpoint, but one that you probably should know. And if you don't know, you know now. He's the one to dethrone Barbados Joe Walcott. Then I'm moving up to the top, Dixie Kid. Now he's going to pop up on this list, as a matter of fact. So we'll talk about him when we get there. Dick O'Brien. As a matter of fact, his name is Fighting Dick O'Brien. Or no, not Fighting Dick O'Brien. I'm thinking about a different Dick, ironically. But Dick O'Brien, great fighter from that period, who competed with a lot of the top level guys. George Kid Levine. Now, there's an interview out there on YouTube, probably on multiple channels at this point, where Barbados Joe Walcott is talking about his time going up against George Kid Levine and what he was up against right there. But Kid Levine, he was a pretty solid overall fighter, just from a resume perspective, who he went up against and what he was able to do there in the ring. But I challenge you to go check out, just go look it up, Barbados Joe Walcott interview. He's at an older age, and he's speaking about that contest. George Green, who I list here, is the original Young Corbett, folks. We kind of talked about that in one of the videos we did here in recent weeks. But you have Young Corbett the second, Young Corbett the third. Those are the three most prominent. There's some other Young Corbett's out there. If you look on BoxRec, for instance, you'll see a bunch of Young Corbett's pop up. But there are only three really who kind of got that sort of namesake. The original, or one that was associated with being the original Young Corbett, that is George Green. He didn't have a ton of fights. He had a pretty solid resume. Just so happened to go up against my man Barbados Joe Walcott. Joe Chowinski, this is who Barbados Joe Walcott knocked out at heavyweight. Joe Chowinski, one of the formidable fighters from that period, talking about the 1800s or late 1800s leading up to the early 1900s. I think he ended his career in only like 10 years. I think he only fought for like about 10 years or whatnot, but hell of a fighter, man who knocked out Jack Johnson, who we'll get to at some point. But Barbados Joe Walcott was able to knock him out, and this was a heavyweight. He was fighting a heavyweight at the time, which is crazy, right? Kid Carter, I wanted to mention that name, former title contender, and he challenged for the world, I want to say welterweight title. I believe it's a welterweight title that he challenged for, came up short, but he's a guy, when you look at his record, you're probably not going to be overly impressed at face value, but you start to go dive into some of the names on that record to change the story for sure. George Gardner, the second ever world light heavyweight champion. He's someone you need to watch for sure. And we talked about him in the last Irish discussion, so be sure to check that out from last week. We were talking Irish boxing greats, and you'll really get to see his resume. Then, of course, Frank Charles, the crafty Texan. Now, as it relates to, Frank Charles, former colored world heavyweight champion, two-time colored world heavyweight champion, the first to actually win the world colored world heavyweight championship a second time, or to actually pick it up again. And he gets the name Crafty Texan just because of his ability. Only about 5'9", would have been in around the 180s, and he was taking on bigger guys at all times and able to do his thing. Had some of the best names in the sport on his resume, from C.C. Smith, the first ever colored world heavyweight champion. Barbados Joe Walcott fought, of course, Frank Charles, and in that contest, Barbados Joe Walcott broke his arm, and he ended up losing that contest, and he got really ridiculed in the media industry. If you look up some of that stuff, there are accounts out there, newspapers and all that stuff. So it was tough. So he had to kind of revive himself from that standpoint, but he certainly put up an effort, but they felt that he quit. And in actuality, he actually broke his arm. So I don't know about you, but hard to compete with a broken arm. But hey, that is what it is. But I do appreciate the accounts for the time, because you can see that they have their sort of mishap, their mistakes, where they may have been forthcoming and jumping out there a little bit early. And then maybe you have to retract. In this case, I don't know if any of them retracted. But that being said, hey, just kind of the nature of the beast there. And it is what it is, you know. It is what it is. But we're going to move ahead here, of course. We're going to move to the next fighter on the list, who Sam Langford ended up facing and knocking out twice, and that is Dixie Kid. Now, the interesting thing about Dixie Kid is he won his world title by defeating, and I mentioned it in the video, I say that loosely, Barbados Joe Walcott. And it ended up being a situation where the referee involved was, or he had a side bet on Dixie Kid, and therefore he disqualified Barbados Joe Walcott in the final round of the contest. And Barbados Joe Walcott actually ended up punching him, I guess you could say assaulting him, in the aftermath of the fight. And it was because of that, but some very shady stuff there. But Dixie Kid, however you want to slice it, or however you want to recognize it, former world welterweight champion, at least for a period. And he is someone who had a ton of fights, as you can see there, and a formidable guy. He could box, no doubt about it. But Sam Langford, when they fought, Sam Langford knocked him out twice there, which I think kind of just speaks to just that power and the just the notion of Sam Langford being one of the most formidable guys right there. Because you talk Barbados Joe Walcott, then the next guy, Dixie Kid right there. Random, and it's like you can't even make this stuff up right here, and that's what makes him sort of a standout there. Random is in terms of he went from champion to champion, and this was before he even hit his prime. So that's something to speak of, you know.
Yeah, it's wild. All the different powerful fighters and different description that Langford got in there with. This their first fight was in 1909. Langford got him out of there in 5 rounds. They retired, threw up the sponge. And coming into that, I think Dixie Kid was on a 6-fight streak. Lost to Langford, went on another 6-fight streak. They rematched in January of 1910. And Langford got him out of there in a nice KO in 3. That was down in Memphis. And Dixie Kid was giving up a little bit of size to Langford, and you really didn't want to be the guy giving up, even if you were really, really good, which he was. You really didn't want to be giving up size to 1909 or 1910 Langford, because this is when Langford was the giant killer. So he was dangerous all the way up the weights by this time. And so if you were smaller than him and he was a hard hitter, even compared to the heavyweights, it was going to be a bad night. And as it happened, he had 2 bad nights. But there's no shame in those losses for him. Langford was something extra dangerous by that time. You know, his myth was international, and it was there for good reason. And he was fighting a busy schedule and beating up a lot of guys, not just Dixie Kid. So, yeah, no shame in the loss. But as you can see, folks, from the graphic there, he had a pretty stiff level of competition. If you look at the history, you see some recognizable names there, some real talent. I'll let you go through it, 86.
All right, yeah, no doubt about it there, Random. So starting with these notable fights here, folks, I want to mention, of course, these are some of the great opponents that Dixie Kid faced, and it just shows you the depth in which these guys' resumes ultimately were. So I think, and I like to go through them because I think that's the best way of just kind of showing and giving individuals an understanding of just how good these guys were. So Joe Walcott, of course, Barbados Joe, who we just previously mentioned. I included Joe Grimm on there mainly because there's a video on the channel. Go check it out. It's a Joe Grimm video. I forget what the title is, but you search on the channel Joe Grimm, or if you search Joe Grimm in general, maybe on YouTube, that might be the one that pops up. But he was this guy who probably has the best chin ever in the history of boxing. And he was in with basically the greatest fighters that the sport has ever seen. He lost the majority of those fights, of course. As a matter of fact, he lost the overwhelming majority of his fights, but it just so happened he was in with the best. And you had guys like Joe Gans, Jack Blackburn, Jack Johnson, you name it. They couldn't knock this guy out. It took Sam McVay to knock him out. Sam McVay was able to pull it off, and Sam McVay was a hell of a fighter right there. If you don't know him, but he's one to check out, though. So that's why I included Joe Grimm in here. I think that might be the last one where I include him. Dave Holly, who we discussed. George Cole, another guy in that same realm as Dave Holly. Very tough, rugged contender from that period, who actually was one of those guys that if you were one of the best in the sport, you had to go through a guy like Dave Holly to prove your mettle. And if you could get past him, all right, hey, you might be onto something. Then you saw a name Willie Lewis there. Now, Willie Lewis, he fought for the, I don't know if it's lightweight, it might have been the world welterweight title, came up short, but one of the great fighters in history, a Philly fighter. And you've heard me say it multiple times, Philly, if you look at it just across the board, talking about from a world standpoint, they probably have the greatest fighters in the history of the sport. When you look at it from a cumulative, just sheer number of fighters in Pennsylvania in general, that has to stand out worldwide, because then you throw in Pittsburgh and some of these other areas, there's no greater fighting location than Pennsylvania. But hey, it's subjective for sure. Most certainly subjective there. Now, Dixie Kid, he was also in there with Harry Duncan. Now, there's a video on the channel, and Harry Duncan, I want to mention him, tough as old oak, but he has relatives who are alive. There's a Harry Duncan website, and he ended up fighting Dixie Kid. And I have a video on the channel of Harry Duncan. It's one of the earlier videos that was done, but I want you to check him out right here. That's what I'll share. Check him out and his relatives. One of them I was in contact with prior to doing it and even mentioning such. And a very good guy. But there's a Harry Duncan website as well. He's from the UK, of course, but he's one you want to check out. George Carpentier, former world light heavyweight champion of the world. And he is one of the best in the sports history, just thinking about it from a technical standpoint. And also, Carpentier, he was one of those guys who was an official. He was a 19-year-old official. Yeah, I think he started when he was 19. And that's crazy, right? Crazy. You think of officials being a little bit older, but he actually officiated the Jack Johnson fight. Gave it the right call, too, a deserved win for Johnson. I forget who Johnson was fighting, but I think it was going down in France, actually. Let me see here. Johnny Summers, contender for the time from the UK. Very solid fighter, solidly built. Get hang and mix it up with the best of them. Had a ton of fights, had a very good resume, but he's someone to check out. His name has popped up in other videos. Larry Temple, he's one of these fighters who was a contending fighter from that period. Of course, one of those that never got a shot at a world title or anything, but he's one that you should certainly know. Now, Jack O'Brien, that's what I was mentioning earlier. Fighting Jack O'Brien, what could have been fighting? Yeah, fighting Jack O'Brien. He is someone who has a ton of fights, a top caliber resume to boot. And he is one that you certainly need to do a little bit of research into. I don't know every tidbit of his career, but he is someone who was able to stand out there in the sport. Then, of course, the Joplin Ghost, Jeff Clark. Now, Jeff Clark, I mean, there are hardly resumes that get any tougher than that of Jeff Clark. Not to mention he was fighting a lot of the top heavyweights from that period. But you see he was in there with Dixie Kidd. Dixie Kidd, former world welterweight champion. That kind of gives you an understanding of just the scale. But Jeff Clark, I mean, he fought freaking Harry Wells, Sam Langford, pretty much all the top guys, all the top heavyweights from the period that would fight him. Went through hell, He lost a good deal, but he won a good deal as well. One of the tougher resumes in the sport, if you look at it from a volume standpoint, in terms of the fighters he had to fight multiple times right there. And I don't think I'm doing him as much justice as he probably deserves. Jimmy Clabby, he fought Les Darcy. So Jimmy Clabby, very good fighter. A little mover and all that stuff, kind of herky-jerky-ish type fighter. He fought Les Darcy for the Australian middleweight championship. Some would consider it the world, but it was Australian middleweight championship. Now, the thing about it, Les Darcy, if you don't know, he's the Australian middleweight champion and Australian heavyweight champion. And he died at 21, but he was one who was in the running for becoming the top guy in middleweight. And he never got a shot at the middleweight world title, but you could argue that at the time that he had the Australian middleweight title, that was even more prominent than that of the world middleweight title. And he had the resume to back from George Chip to freaking the Bayern Globetrotter, Jeff Smith, Jimmy Clabby, who we mentioned here, Eddie McGordy, you name it. He's a top caliber fighter. There's a video on the channel of Les Darcy. It's the Wonder, the Maitland Wonder is where sort of that nickname derives. Check it out. Trust me. Les Darcy, one of my favorite fighters. I think one of the great middleweights in the history of the sport, gone too soon at the age of 21, as mentioned. I also bench Dick Nelson. So that's what I'm thinking about, not Jack O'Brien. Oh, yeah, the Jack O'Brien I mentioned. I screwed it up, but Jack O'Brien up top is Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, who's going to come up, but we're not going to dive into him. But fighting Dick Nelson, that's the guy I was trying to think about, who has a ton of fights, who actually was in with top caliber competition. Fighting Dick Nelson, look him up. He is, just based off the sheer volume as well as the competition, one of the best of the sporting scene. I can't remember if he fought for a world title. He might have, but there's one that you need to check out right there. And I don't know his overall career in depth enough to just dive into it right now, but check Trust me when I tell you, fighting Dick Nelson. He's someone to check out. Young Lowry, he had a brother. I think they were twins, as a matter of fact. He was a very good contender from this period, and he was in with a lot of top-level names. Of course, Harry Lewis, who we mentioned previously. Harry Lewis was the world welterweight champion. Tough resume as well. Jack Goldswain, another British fighter who actually had a very good resume, who was able to do a lot of good things in the sport in itself. But again, folks, we appreciate you being here. Of course, 86 Boxing here with Random Acoustic Thoughts. We're talking the great Sam Langford. A video was released on the channel that doesn't dive deep into his career, but just kind of mentions some names there, and just to give you sort of an insight into just how good this fighter was. And as a matter of fact, we can move to the next guy, and this is one where
86, real quick, if I may, just briefly, I forgot to mention the first win Langford got over Dixie Kid was at the Armory in Boston. So that's the same building he beat Joe Gans in almost 6 years earlier.
Crazy.
Just fun fact. The other thing is Larry Temple actually did get a welterweight title shot against Joe Walcott at the end of 1903 season in December, but he did not win the title. He gave him a hell of a fight. It was actually a pretty near run thing, but Walcott did retain the title. Larry Temple also beat Sam Langford himself in 1905, the first time they fought. Langford got that one back. They fought more than once, but the first time they met, Temple actually got the best of Langford, which was, you know, a feather in his cap, maybe his best win, but he had a tough career, that guy. Just thought I'd mention that, but go right ahead, sir.
Yeah, no, that's good stuff there, Random. That's why I appreciate having you here. Random Acoustic Thoughts, folks. I'm telling you, when it comes to the Sam Langford just career and history, he is the go-to. Go subscribe to him right now. Random Acoustic Thoughts. I'm telling you, you will enjoy it. He already has some content out there diving deeper into Sam Langford, deeper than I've been as far as any discussions I've had on Sam Langford. So I highly recommend you check out Random Acoustic Thoughts. So with that, Random, the person I was going to move to was his journey now leaving the welterweight division, moving up to middleweight. And it was, of course, against a guy that a name that a lot of those know right there, none other than my man, the Michigan assassin, Stanley Ketchel, one of the biggest punchers in the history of the sport in itself. Of course, his career was derailed, and you'll understand why. That being said, Random, wanted to get your thoughts on this particular contest because it was Sam Langford going up against Stanley Ketchel in a non-title fight, keyword non-title, but there were plans later down the road there in 1910, because this happened in 1910, the first fight, and the second fight would have happened a little bit later there in 1910. There were plans for them to rematch with the world middleweight title on the line, but those were in a sense derailed in this very unfortunate situation, of course. But Random, I know you're all too familiar with it.
Yeah, these are great fighters. Ketchel was a finisher, so people love that. And this was a season of Langford's where he'd actually suffered a setback. He was on this wonderful streak that had lasted since the end of 1906 when he came back from a couple losses, one of which we'll be talking about later on. But by 1910, he was on this long streak. He hadn't lost in a long time, lots of fights. But he started off, as we just mentioned, he started off the year stopping Dixie Kid down in Memphis in 3 rounds. But then he actually lost a newspaper decision to Fireman Jim Flynn, a light heavyweight and eventual heavyweight contender at the time. A lot more of the newspapers thought Flynn got the best of it, but they did rematch. Langford stopped a guy, Nat Dewey, down in Cheyenne, Wyoming, in between their fights. Then he fought and stopped Jim Barry. This was earlier in the month that he had fought Ketchel. So he stopped Jim Barry in Vernon, California, the same arena he'd stopped Jim Flynn in their rematch of the year, the second fight of the year. So he stops Barry on the 14th in the 16th round of a scheduled 25. And then on the 27th, he's over in Philly fighting 6 rounds against Ketchel. Again, Langford's very busy career, not just high level, but also packed in tight. And the Ketchel fight, opinions were different. There was at least one paper that was very strongly thought Ketchel schooled him. And then some papers who thought it was an even thing, and then somewhat more papers that thought Langford got the best of things, even though he might have been holding back a little bit. He didn't throw a lot of straight rights. He didn't use some of his more effective techniques. Although Ketchel seems hurt him with a body shot. I think it was in the end of the 4th round, if I'm not mistaken. But they had a good tear up, but it wasn't like, it was satisfying, but it wasn't like, they don't seem to have gone all out. But there were attempts to match Ketchel and Langford in 1909 in California, but it didn't happen because they offered Ketchel $20,000 guaranteed plus expenses. Langford was offered $5,000, and Langford's manager said the split had to be a little bit more equitable. Partly because Langford had been famous longer than Ketchel, even though Stanley was a big star and a very, very popular fighter. But Langford had already been famous before Ketchel was anybody, so they thought they should have a little bit more of a equitable split. And there was also concerns that Ketchel's fight with Jack Johnson would be ruined if he lost to Langford. So it ended up not happening. They did end up getting together after some stopping and starting, and there were attempts to rematch them. I think it was going to be the day before the big Johnson Jeffries super fight, or 2 days before or the day before. Their plans did shift around a little bit, but it didn't come together. Ketchel said he had hurt his wrist in the fight before the Langford fight against Frank Klaus, very dangerous fighter you know about. And Ketchel wasn't going to do any long fights for a while. So the attempts to put him in a finish fight or a 45 rounder just didn't work. But it could have happened. Maybe when Ketchel got a little heavier, he was still a young man, but sadly he was, murdered late in the year, and it just didn't happen. But this is an example of two great fighters. It wasn't the perfect circumstance, fighting just the 6 rounds, but they did get in there together, which is better than a lot of missed matchups, which just never happened, or that when they happened, they were both super old or something like that. It was a better circumstance than that. They did get in there in their primes, during their primes. It just, the rematch just couldn't happen. But the fact that they did fight, the two, widely considered the best middleweights on planet Earth.
Oh, yeah.
Ketchel was more widely recognized as the actual champion, but there were people who said until these two fought, there wasn't an acclaimed champion. There wasn't a universally acclaimed champion. If this is the time of claim, there's no commission, so it was just what everybody collectively thought. And there weren't too many opinions that were universal. But Ketchel was considered the man, to be clear, but some people were thinking he had outgrown the class and that he couldn't make. And others thought neither he nor Langford could actually make the middleweight limit, the 158. Although 154, there were still people saying it should be 154, like back when Fitzsimmons won it. So yeah, it gets, as you know, it gets real complicated. But
the non-Pharrell Jack Dipsy times.
Yeah, way back in the day when that was 154. But then, later, like Jack O'Brien, other guys were at 158. And there were a lot of writers by then, 158 was what they would accept as the middleweight limit. But it wasn't set down. There were attempts to set it down in stone. It just wasn't time yet, There have been attempts back in 1904, but it just wasn't time yet. Even these years later, it just didn't work out. But it is great that they got in there together and they did give the fans a bit of a show. Although we can be sad that on multiple levels that the way the rest of Ketchel's career panned out, because he was a great fighter. Who knows what he would have gone on to do as he went through his mid-20s into his late 20s and put on some pounds up there at light heavyweight. That could have been a real golden age of the division, anchored around guys like him and Langford and Jeanette.
Yeah, that would have been something special there for sure. Unfortunately, we didn't get to see that piece of it, but Ketchel, he made his name, because even to this day, when you think about big punchers, think about Ring's list of biggest punchers in history, then he's going to pop up on there, and the name still rings bells to this day. Real quick shout out to Alistair Overeem, who dropped in. Appreciate you there, Alistair. Thanks for dropping by there, buddy. Shared some good insight. Mentioned that Langford versus Ketchel, last time Gans ever stepped foot in the ring as a part of Sam's corner. Yeah, that's pretty crazy right there, Just thinking about from an overall standpoint, I believe it was 1909 when Gans died. We talked about Gans a little bit earlier, but he died of tuberculosis. He was at the Jack Johnson versus Jim Jeffries fight there in 1909. And I think that was his last public appearance right there. So I think he died in 1909. Unfortunate tuberculosis. We talked about that a little bit, and some of the guys that died of tuberculosis during that period who were boxers who competed. Some of them active, some retired. It was crazy just thinking about it. Shout out to Dan as well, who dropped by. Says he's late. Hey, appreciate you, Dan. Just have you in here in the mix. Always a good thing. Be sure to check him out, folks. Dan always shares some good insight in the comments as well. Shout out to my man Blake Gallimore. Said he read this fight was sort of a planned draw, so the rematch would be a big money fight. Yes, indeed. There, Langford Ketchel. That rematch would have been something super special, and it would most certainly have been filmed, because we were in that period right there, and it would have been filmed, and I think it would have been a hell of a fight.
Would have brought him some good money. And it's worth mentioning that, fighting in Philly at this time, not so much a prearranged draw, but there was no decision allowed if both men were on their feet at the end of the fight. No one was DQ'd or knocked out. So sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes though, booking a big fight in Philly was seen as a prelude to a larger fight because they wouldn't be fighting to decision. Structurally, they couldn't because of the rules in Philly at the time. The great Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, who you mentioned earlier, he was the king of those 6-rounders. He fought everybody, it seemed like, at a super busy schedule, but it was a lot of not exclusively, but a lot of 6-rounders. So Langford fought in Philly, a lot of guys. Dave Hawley, who you mentioned earlier, the powerful lightweight turned welterweight. He was a kind of a specialist in those 6-rounders, although, again, he fought longer fights as well. But I just want to mention quickly, after the Ketchel fight, Langford stayed in Philly. He got the best of big old battling Jim Johnson in Philly. Then he went over the Bronx and knocked out the Michigan Giant, Al Kubiak, a heavyweight of the day. Then he was down back at the Armory in Boston again on Tremont Street, winning a 15-round decision against his rival Joe Jeanette, one of their many fights. Then he was down in Joplin, Missouri. He knocked out Jeff Clark, who you mentioned, in 2. And then he closed out the year in December, stopping Morris Harris again at the Armory in Boston in 2 rounds. So he had a busy year. He didn't just fight Ketchel and then hang out. He had 2 fights in May. After 2 fights in April, he had 2 fights in May. So it was the nature of the time when the top boxers, it wasn't just being able to save up your energy and win a fight and then sit around. Unless you were already rich, you kind of had to keep fighting, and fights did move around depending on the results. I'll just say briefly, so in 1903, right after Joe Gans had suffered defeat to Sam Langford, Langford was booked against Mike Twin Sullivan, who you mentioned, fought fought Gans. Well, Langford was supposed to fight Mike Twin in Chelsea at the end of the year, but then he had a draw with Jack Blackburn where Blackburn got the best of it, and the club moved Blackburn into the slot. Langford didn't get the fight. So he actually lost a fight over a prearranged draw. So even though, both men on the feet, it had to be a draw, the ref had to call it a draw, the press didn't care. They treated that like a loss to Blackburn, and even one of the clubs actually took him out of a booking over it. So just to highlight for your listeners how volatile sometimes the booking was, you couldn't necessarily count on things. You had to keep performing. And if you're in a position where you had to keep earning, that's why some of these fights fell through and stuff. It wasn't always because the participants pulled out. Sometimes the club would switch it up. Yeah. Fireman Jim Flynn wanted to get in on Stanley Ketchel, but he lost the rematch of that year. It's the 3rd overall fight, but he lost that fight to Langford. But he wanted to challenge the winner of Langford Ketchel.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty crazy when you think about it. Showed you the layers of this history and some of the things that went into it for sure there, with Langford essentially being blocked out, Blackburn in, and these were all great fighters, So, man, just think about that. Kind of just short notice right there. It changed. You go from Langford to Blackburn. Something crazy, something special right there to certainly think about for sure. Dan mentions that Ketchel was a bad morphine, he had a bad morphine addiction, about 140 pounds and alcoholic since age 15. He was 22, dead a month after turning 24. They were apparently just setting up the San Francisco fight. Yeah, that was supposed to happen For sure, there, Dan. That was definitely supposed to happen. It would have been something special had it happened. Real quick, jumping through Ketchel's resume. Of course, we didn't get we only get up to some of the notable names. He had some other names, but these are the notable names prior to his death. At the very least, there, Jack Johnson, of course, the world heavyweight champion, who we'll hear again for sure. And also, we have Jack Sullivan, which is the brother of Mike Sullivan, Jack Twin Sullivan, Mike Twin Sullivan. You see those two names both there. So Stanley Ketchel knocked both of them out in back-to-back fights. I have a little shorts video out there on the channel where I mentioned that might be the only time where two twins were knocked out in back-to-back fights. I think, as a matter of fact, that is the only time, unless something happens with the Charlo brothers. Certainly that's what it is. And Jack O'Brien, Philadelphia, that is, former world light heavyweight champion. That's a name I wanted to mention there, who, of course, Stanley Ketchel was in with. Jack O'Brien, he spent a good deal of time at middleweight, so he racked up a lot of fights. Random was just mentioning how he did a number of 6 rounds, etc., but another pretty impressive resume. One that once we get to it, of course, you'll see that, hey, sometimes you just have to cut some names off. You can't get to everyone. I mentioned Willie Lewis, very underrated fighter. There will be a video. I want to do a video at some point on Willie Lewis, just to show you how good this guy was right there. Very common like name if you just think about it. Willie Lewis. You don't think much of it, but hell of a fighter from his period right there. Then, of course, Ketchel's greatest rival, none other than Billy Papke, and the two had about 4 or 5 fights somewhere in there, all fights where they were banging, and that's probably his greatest rival. Just think about it from an overall standpoint. So Stanley Ketchel, Billy Papke. I know for sure that 4th fight is on film now. I don't think there's any other fight on film, but it's amazing that we do have that 4th fight on film. Then Frank Claus, I want to mention, another world middleweight champion, and he was a damn good fighter, not one with a deep amount of fights in terms of overall volume, but in terms of the fights that he did fight, hey, you can't get any better than that, real talk. So be sure to check out Frank Claus. Want to do something on him at some point down the road as well. And let me see here. Pull it back up. Oh, yeah, Porky Dan Flynn. Porky Dan Flynn, very good resume right there. He was just in with a number of the best fighters from the period. So he has one of those contending resumes, and he would fight guys bigger than him, all that stuff, heavyweights. So
he trained with Langford. Flynn trained with Langford, Porky Dan. And the nickname was because he liked pork chops. He wasn't actually fat.
Yeah.
There are photos out on the internet if you do a search, folks. He wasn't chubby. He was in shape. He was just apparently that was his favorite food.
Yeah, old Porky Dan Flynn. But yeah, hey, he was a fighter who mixed it up with the best of them for sure. So you look him up, as Random mentioned there, and you'll get to see. Now we're gonna move on to the other middleweight challenger that Langford ended up facing, and that was none other than the Georgia Deacon himself, Theodore Tiger Flowers. Now, Tiger Flowers, former world middleweight champion. Matter of fact, the first black world middleweight champion, 1926. And the ironic thing, we've talked about it on the channel before, is there was a documentary made on him that would have started filming, I'm guessing, around 1925 or maybe even 1926, somewhere in that time frame. And it existed at one point, but is listed as lost in the official records. And the irony of that is the fact that, of course, he won the title against Harry Greb, who we have no actual fight footage of, though we do have some training footage, which grateful to have that. But just imagine that if we were able to come across that Tiger Flowers documentary, we'd have Harry freaking Greb as well, because the Tiger Flowers story has to have Harry Greb in it. But that's just one of the sort of kind of downside or the situation surrounding such. But anyway, he was a middleweight champion as mentioned, but he would fight guys who were bigger as well. A defensive fighter in terms he was known for his formidable defense, etc. But just all around very good fighter. And he fought Sam Langford, got knocked out 2 rounds, if I'm not mistaken, as a matter of fact. But That's kind of the case when you're dealing with a guy like Sam Langford. And at the time, Sam Langford was a bigger guy. This was 1922, if I recall correct. And therefore, Langford, he was likely coming in the bigger fighter. And despite Tiger Flowers having sort of the defensive prowess that he did, hey, it didn't matter when it came to that sort of power. You know, they say that's the last thing that leaves. So Langford, he fought well beyond and well past his prime. So therefore, he maintained that power and carried that throughout his career, even during the periods in which he was blind and couldn't see, pretty much out of one, and then ultimately had bad vision in both eyes. But one thing that remained was the power there, Random, and I know you're familiar with that. And I know he used to get in and kind of just feel his way around, get in close to fighters. And hey, Langford's power was no doubt real. You think about it, lightweight to heavyweight, he was able to knock opponents out in each class. So that shows you the type of power that he had.
Yeah, at this point in his career, I mean, he'd suffered an eye injury against Big Fred Fulton, the Rochester Plasterer, back in 1917 in Boston. And so we're way on in 1922, but the 22 season, and it really was a season, he had a ton of fights. He had lost 3 of his first 4 fights that year. He lost to the great Harry Wills, and he had beaten Cyclone Smith after that, but then he'd lost on points to Big Bill Tate, and then got disqualified against Tut Jackson. But following that fight, that was, when did that one happen? April 6th. After that, he went on a 29-fight unbeaten run that lasted into the 23 season, and Flowers was part of that run. I think he won, let's see, he had like 4 fights, won or drawn, and then he fought Flowers. And he just had so much power and so much experience by this point, and he kept a busy schedule, so he was a well-oiled machine. Whatever machine was left of him was well-oiled. He was the bigger man, and he could kind of fight on feel. And that's, at this point in his career, he didn't have any depth perception because he only had one eye. And I don't know if he'd started, the cataract in the other eye had started impairing his what vision he had left by this point, or if that was subsequent seasons. But he was still able to be really dangerous and win or draw against, like I said, 29 in a row after the DQ to Tut Jackson. So Flowers was just outgunned. He landed a lot, but again, he didn't necessarily have the power to hurt Langford, but he landed an awful lot in those 2 rounds before he got caught. But again, you know, Langford's power was something special, especially at this time when he was heavier. He wasn't as mobile as before, but if you keep going into the firing line of it, you know, you catch a bad one. That's what happened to Mr. Flowers here. Great fighter he was, though.
Yeah, no doubt right there, Random. And yeah, he goes down in history. Someone you'll hear out of Georgia is mentioned, a name that one must respect. Just thinking about it from an overall standpoint, because former world middleweight champion, first black middleweight champion, as a matter of fact. So he put up and shut up. Unfortunately, died at a younger age. Him and Harry Greb, and they were rivals in some sense, suffered similar fates where anesthesia, while getting some kind of work done, generally on the nose, they ended up dying or never recovering from the anesthesia. You think about it, during those periods, there was still a lot to be learned, etc. Very unfortunate right there. Very unfortunate. But looking at his resume, of course, you see the name Harry Greb, one of the most formidable fighters in the history of the sport, possibly the greatest fighter. Now, when you think about rivals to, or someone you could rank up there with Sam Langford, of course, then Harry Greb is the name. And he is deservedly so, has probably the best resume in the history of the sport. Him and Langford for sure, but hey, you could argue Harry Greb's is even better. And just one of those things there for sure. You got Kid Norfolk, lightweight. He competed middleweight, light heavyweight, and he was a big time fighter. Had a ton of fights. He would fight heavyweights. There's footage of Kid Norfolk out there fighting Big Bill Tate. I have some of that on the channel. As a matter of fact, I added all of the footage together, and you get to see him competing against Big Bill Tate. Excuse me, Fireman Jim Flynn, contender for the time at heavyweight. He knocked out Jack Johnson, or I'm sorry, Jack Dempsey. Because think about that, Fireman Jim Flynn knocked out Jack Dempsey. Now Dempsey avenged that loss in a similar fashion, but Fireman Jim Flynn, tough competitor at that time, and not a world champion, but hell of a fighter right there. Hell of a name as well. Fireman Jim Flynn. Jack Delaney, former world light heavyweight champion. I want to dive into him a bit more right there, but a premier fighter. Jackie Clark, someone else who fought for a world title at, might have been middleweight. Ton of fights. Same with Jock Malone, another guy with a ton of fights who fought for a world, I believe he fought for a world title. Of course, Mike McTeague. This is a name that you'll hear very much. There's some video out there, a little bit of video out there of Mike McTeague as well, but just all around one of the premier fighters from that period, these earlier days, and someone you should understand and know of right there, who competed with some of the best. Just dive into his resume. I can't dive directly into it myself. Slapsy Maxie Rosenblum, former world light heavyweight champion. He fought at middleweight and all that stuff up, went up heavyweight as well. Another one of those guys who, like Greb, had an insane amount of fights, but absolutely no video exists of him competing there in a ring in an official fight. Can you imagine that? 300 plus fights and no video of him. Slapsy Maxie Rosenblum, one of the most formidable fighters in the sport. You look at his resume, it just runs super deep. He had probably about, I don't know, maybe in the 50s in terms of losses or something like that, but he had 300 plus fights or something like that. I can't remember exactly, but he was the guy who didn't have a lot of power in his hands, so he had a limited amount of knockouts. So think about that. He didn't have the power to knock his guys out, so he had to box his way through all those contests. So you never know what happens in terms of judging, some hometown decisions, some other stuff that could have been extracurricular. But that being said, Slapsy Maxie Rosenblum, one of the great fighters in the history of the sport right there. Then I'll move up to the top. The Toy Bulldog, Mickey Walker, former welterweight world champion, former, if I'm remembering correctly, middleweight world champion. And the Toy Bulldog even fought at heavyweight, thinking about that. I've talked about it before in videos. There's footage out there. He fought Harry Greb too. I wish that we got that fight. That was a hell of a fight from all accounts and recordings. But that being said, Mickey Walker, he fought Max Smelling. He fought Jack Sharkey, two world heavyweight champions. He lost to Max Smelling, got knocked out, but he drew with Jack Sharkey. You get to see like a legitimate middleweight going at it against a freaking heavyweight right there. It's a crazy thing to see, but it shows you it was done, and I wish we had even more footage of it. Panama Joe Gans, one of the fighting Joe Gans, he was a very formidable fighter, a fighter who Harry Greb, essentially you could say, almost ducked or whatever. He refused to face Panama Joe Gans. And Panama Joe Gans, if you think about those that took on a Joe Gans namesake, he might be the best of them. And he was actually out of Barbados, if I'm not mistaken. But that being said, he was able to make a name in the sport, did his thing, and he ended up. Hey, Harry Greb didn't fight him, but he had a lot of other names on the resume that shows you that he was a top tier fighter. He fought a couple of other Joe Gans as well. I think he fought an Italian Joe Gans. I have a video on the channel called "The Top 6 Fighting Joe Gans." Look it up. You'll see what I'm talking about right there, because you had a number of individuals who took that Joe Gans namesake. I want to do that with some of the other fighters that are out there as well. Tut Jackson, Random mentioned him, contending heavyweight from the period, solidly built guy who mixed it up with a number of the best. Jamaica Kid, he actually fought for a world title. I believe it was light heavyweight, something like that. But I don't know a ton about Jamaica Kid. And he didn't have a resume that, or at least a record that would be appealing to some who are used to seeing singular numbers. But that being said, he was a guy who could mix it up with the best of them. Lou Bogash fought for a world title as well. Another one of those guys with a ton of fights. Allentown Joe Gans, another one of the fighting Joe Gans. I think he may have fought Panama Joe Gans, if I'm not mistaken. And he was a solid fighter from that particular period. Pete Latzo, former world, I believe, middleweight champion. Hell of a fighter. Same with Leo Lomsky. I believe Leo Lomsky won a middleweight championship, if I'm not mistaken there. I could be a little bit off, but check those guys out. Latso, Lomsky, Allentown, Joe Gans, and you'll see what we're talking about here. And check out that Joe Gans video, the top 6 fighting Joe Gans, because I think it's very revealing. And with that there, of course, Random, going to move on to the next guy. Of course, Philadelphia, Jack O'Brien, one of the most formidable fighters in the sport's history. You mentioned him a little bit earlier there, Random, but the interesting thing is he went up against Sam Langford. Now, at this time, what I recall, Jack O'Brien was fighting at middleweight, or at least he was around that middleweight limit, and he would go on to fight at heavyweight, of course. Yeah, he got knocked out by Sam Langford in, I believe, 2 rounds. But that being said, hey, Sam Langford, a tough guy to deal with. He might have been giving up some weight there against Langford at that particular time. And just Langford, man, super determined guy, no matter when you ultimately ended up facing him.
Yeah, well, for the O'Brien fight, they were fairly close in weight. I think they were both in and around that 170 range or just below it. But O'Brien was a little bit past his prime by this point. I mean, he was, if on BoxRec at least, going into the fight, he had 147 wins, which is incredible. 14 losses and 24 draws. Again, in this time, a close fight might be a draw, even if one guy or the other had a bit of an edge. But yeah, and O'Brien got, I think he lasted into the 5th. They fought in New York. This was Langford's 8th fight of the year. And he hadn't lost all year. He'd beaten Joe Jeanette to kick off the season. Then he stopped a heavyweight, New York heavyweight Fred Atwater. Then he went over to England in February and beat the Australian future and former Australian heavyweight champion Bill Lang. Then he went over to Paris and drew over 20 rounds with great Sam McVeigh. That was the first fight with the fantastic McVeigh rivalry that lasted for years. Then he in May he was back in the States, and he fought in Syracuse, New York, stopping Ralph Calloway. That was supposed to be Big Sandy Ferguson that night, but I guess Sandy didn't show up. Then he stopped a guy, Jack Fitzgerald, in New York. Then, let's see, Jim Smith stopped him in New York, and then he fought O'Brien. And then after the O'Brien fight, he stopped Tony Ross. He drew with Joe Jeanette, and he had 2 more. Stopped Tony Capone in New York. Then he went to Australia and fought McVeigh again and lost his first official loss since 1906, when young Peter Jackson, who you mentioned, had stopped him in 2006. McVeigh at the end of 1911, that was the first official points loss Langford had suffered since that fight years before. So O'Brien got the full wrath of Langford right in the smack in Langford's intense prime, because Langford gave up quite a bit of weight to McVeigh. That wasn't necessarily an even matchup as far as their physical attributes. So the fact that O'Brien was close to Langford, yeah, it was a bad night. Langford was said to be kind of toying with him, and a lot of all the old timers were at that fight calling each other out. And I think Kid McCoy was talking about a comeback. He was 1,000 years old by that point, likely in his 40s or something. But yeah, different guys were. It was sort of a big deal of entertainment there, but it was also it's hard to come back, and the papers afterwards were saying that of O'Brien, who'd had a great career. And later there's actually footage, as you know, 86, there's footage of Jack O'Brien training the great Harry Greb. Greb's at his training quarters and he's putting him through the motions. They do a little sparring and stuff, but and even as an older man, Jack O'Brien was still pretty ripped. He stayed in good shape. He was a factor at middleweight and light heavyweight and at heavyweight, and beating him meant a lot. Even the older version like that, it was a fight Langford wanted years before, but better late than never, and he got the win. How it would have gone earlier, if Langford had gotten the fight, say in 05 or 06, I'm not sure. O'Brien was extremely, extremely good, capable and mobile, and who knows what might have happened. But when they did actually fight, yeah, Langford smashed him with ease. Oh, I think you're muted, 86.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you there. I was going to say timing sometimes factor in as well. Thank you there for that, Random. Good stuff indeed there. Let me see real quick. Yeah, I mentioned Random. How about the great article report? Great battle with Ketchel. You go, oh, yeah, you did mention that, Dan. Salute to that. Went on the left foot from Ketchel with extreme prejudice. The Alistair Overeem says, Sam said, this boy is making a mistake. He makes another one. We're going home early. Sam KO Tiger a few seconds later. Yes, good stuff right there. Alistair. Then Dan mentioned Philadelphia retirement fight. Last fight of Philadelphia, Jack and Sam just did a solid for retirement. No doubt about it. Shout out to Mark Bergeron, who
It was
had
probably
dropped
good
by.
to make money, but O'Brien trained for weeks for that fight, which for him was actually a long time, because he had previously in his career kept a very busy schedule himself. O'Brien was no joke in that regard. But yeah, he trained hard for the fight, but he just couldn't get past Langford. It was too much. But Jack O'Brien had fought across the color line, but then had actually drawn the color line at a point. So there were fights that people wanted, like Joe Jeanette. After Joe Jeanette beat Langford on Christmas Day in 1905, he wanted a Jack O'Brien fight, but O'Brien had drawn the color line. Langford was pretty much anyone wanted to fight O'Brien because he was such a huge name. It was he was a draw. And so it was a good name to have on your resume, but
Philly fighter.
yeah, later on, O'Brien, like many, he withdrew his objection. You mentioned the big Jeffries-Jack Johnson fight. Well, Jeffries had drawn the color line on Johnson before Jeffries retired.
Yeah.
They used to joke about Jack would wake up in the morning and call out Jim Jeffries. Like every day, that was his regular thing. So, and then when Jeffries withdrew his objection, he got schooled. Sometimes if there's a lesson there, maybe sometimes don't duck someone when you still got a lot in the tank yourself, get it over with when you have a chance. Because when Jack O'Brien did get in there with Langford, he got battered and the ref stopped it to save him from being completely knocked out. But he caught an ugly left hook while he was trying to make space. Caught a big old left hook, and then that was it for him. So yeah, it was tough, but it's fight politics, the timing and all that. It's never been easy. It's never been easy going all the way back to the beginning of the gloved era. It's never been easy to get the top guys in there with each other. Maybe on occasion, but in general, it's actually quite difficult to get conditions just right. So we're lucky we got anything at all. It feels that way sometimes, right? When the big fights do happen, you're like, oh, at last. Finally got one going.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Hey, it's one of those things. And hey, I appreciate the fact that we do have some of this stuff out here on film, but we always have the accounts that we can dive into. So when you're doing research, of course, Random knows you spend a lot of time in newspapers, things of that nature, and you're diving through and just getting accounts in different iterations of stories and such. Shout out to Mark, who dropped by, says, just read recently that Dempsey admitted to being scared of one boxer in his life, Sam Langford. These were earlier years of his career, but still, you don't hear that every day. Yep, and some of that could have been in hyperbole in some sense right there, but hey, Langford was one of those guys who was formidable even when he was well past his prime, even when he had one eye, even when he got to having one eye with very shaky vision in the other. He was just one of those guys.
It really was. Like the year he lost sight one eye, 1917, he still won fights before the year was out. I think that happened to him in July, and he still won fights before the year was closed. I mean, he was, can you imagine that? Like you get whatever happened to him, and then you're just out for a matter of months. It's not like I'm gonna take a year off, have surgery, and all this. Pretty wild times,
Oh yeah,
Not necessarily the recommended. The Sam Langford story doesn't have a happy ending. He was broken blind, but the journey was singular. So that's kind of what we choose to celebrate. Just like many fighters, with Muhammad Ali, you don't. The ending. I mean, you honor the man's ending, but you don't necessarily dwell on that compared to the greatness of the actual run, the prime in the ring. Langford's a lot like that.
No, you're right. And there's a little bit of video out there. You get to see Langford in older age, and he's in good spirits. But he was at one point living off $1 and something day, or maybe week. Maybe it was a week or something like that. And it's very unfortunate. Certainly a story not or a story familiar with some of the other greats that we've seen in the sports. You think about even his rival, for instance, Sam McVeigh. He died with no money. Jack Johnson paid for his burial. But you saw that with a lot of these top guys, even back then, who blew through money. And I'd imagine it was a combination of course, you're getting the type of figures that you probably hadn't ever seen in your life. And of course, it's kind of hard to control and maintain it, especially left to your own dereliction. And I think that's type of stuff factored in. Dan mentions Philadelphia Jack fought two draws for heavyweight champion, actually outpointed and basically beat Jack Johnson, but had to be KO'd to take the title, or had to be a KO. Draw against Tommy Burns, too. Oh, yeah, I remember that. I know we got that footage of the Tommy Burns contest. Philadelphia Jack, he's kind of staying away that entire time. Well, at least from the footage, seemed to be running a good deal. But no, hey, that stuff right there. Certain things you can, certainly things you can factor in. Mark Bergeron says Tommy Burns was seriously underrated. I read in his bio a while back, quite impressed. Or you read his bio a while back, quite impressive. And his quite impressive path in his career, no doubt about it. The little giant from Hanover there, Tommy Burns, he was a hell of a fighter for sure. And he was a traveling heavyweight. You know, he pretty much racked up the championships in other areas, and he wasn't afraid to put his title on the line. And of course, we know he faced Jack Johnson. The price was certainly right, but he ended up ultimately being that guy to actually face him, to cross that color line for the world heavyweight title.
Yeah, and it's also worth mentioning, you know, before he fought Johnson, they couldn't get the money right for both parties. They got Burns' end correct, but like with Ketchel and Langford, they couldn't get the opponent's money right. But he almost fought Sam McVeigh in Paris. And after he lost the title to Johnson, as well as trying to get a rematch with Johnson, because he still had backers who would put money behind him, but there were 3 near-miss bookings with Langford. The last of which very nearly happened, but he had, I think it was a railway accident. He got hurt. But yeah, very nearly, Burns almost fought Langford on several occasions. And so it was, I think it was going to be in California the first time, and then in Philly, perhaps the second time. The third one would have been in London, but it didn't happen. But Tommy Burns was a willing fella, and he was another short guy. He was, 5'7", 5'7.5", depending on who you asked. Just like Langford.
Champion in history, at least on record.
Yeah, and he took it, like you said, he took it on the road. He went, because at this time, a lot of how it would work, even though America was the hotbed, you had national champions. So when Jim Jeffries retired and Burns got the title that Marvin Hart had earned in the new iteration, he took it on the road and started fighting. As long as the money was right, go fighting the champions from other countries to sort of establish himself. Yeah, Burns is very underrated today because he was sort of dismissed in his day by some writers who wanted an American, not a Canadian, and they wanted them fighting in America, not around the world, which is what Burns did a lot of. Credit to him, because he was willing to face Langford, and a lot of guys weren't. Oh, you're muted, brother.
Oh yeah, no doubt about it. There, Random. Thanks. It would have been a hell of a fight. I wish we would have gotten it. Real quick to jump through to the resume. I mentioned some guys there. Just a ton of people that Philadelphia Jack O'Brien was in with, and it's hard to really put it into perspective from an overall standpoint because he basically faced from all weights, and he was one of those guys that pretty much was one of the best just in general right there. But you think about the likes of Tommy Ryan. There's a video on the channel of Tommy Ryan, welterweight and middleweight world champion. As mentioned, Jack O'Brien, he did compete a lot at middleweight. And Tommy Ryan, man, one of the best fighters in the history of the sport. I think the video that's on the channel does it justice. To know boxing, you got to know Tommy Ryan. Bobby Dobbs, of course, we've mentioned Barbados Joe Walcott, Jack Bonner. We've mentioned Tommy West, another competitive guy from that period. George Budge Byers. There's a video on the channel on George Budge Byers from the slums in Canada. Matter of fact, cousin of the original Old Chocolate George Godfrey. And there's a video on the channel. Check it out if you have it. I'm thinking you'll enjoy it right there. Middleweight and heavyweight colored world champion. So he's worth mentioning. Mike Schreck, hell of a fighter from that period. I need to dive a bit more into Mike Schreck myself personally, but if you look at his resume, you'll see an abundance of top-level names that he competed against. Charles Kid McCoy, former world middleweight champion. There, he fought Tommy Ryan as well. Then, of course, Tommy Burns we mentioned, and that was Philadelphia Jackals Bryan's shot at the world heavyweight title when he fought Tommy Burns. George Cole, the names come up, same as young Peter Jackson. Peter Marr pops up. Peter Marr, the Irish Giant, claimant of the world heavyweight championship. Now, he wasn't officially champion, but he was certainly a claimant of such, and a formidable fighter out of Ireland, and he had a hell of a resume to boot, you name it. This guy mentioned, of course, he fought freaking Black Prince Peter Jackson, and Peter Jackson beat him in Ireland, knocked him out, as a matter of fact. But hell of a fighter right there. Peter Marr, he deserves the video of his own right there. The Irish Giant. Then, of course, Marvin Hart, who was world heavyweight champion after James J. Jeffries retired there in 1904. He retired, of course, that was his last year prior to coming back against Jack Johnson. But he was a hell of a fighter as well. He had the win over Jack Johnson, similar to the Gans Barbados Joe Walcott fight, where Hart was the aggressor, though you could argue that Jack Johnson outpointed him. But that being said, the referee with the aggressor, you know what I'm saying? So it's one of those things to factor in. Then you have Kid Carter, fought for the world welterweight title. Hell of a fighter. Another one with a resume that can be very deceiving. But if you look at who he fought, some of the best in the sport, Jack Twin Sullivan, who we mentioned, and of course, the fighting blacksmith, Bob Fitzsimmons, the first three-weight world champion in the sport, won the title at heavyweight, light heavyweight, and middleweight, rather. First, of course, being middleweight, then heavyweight, then light heavyweight was the last one, which is interesting, right? But that being said, one of the best in the sport. And that leads us there, random, into what I mentioned in the video that is on the channel. And if you haven't checked it out, folks, again, we're here, 86 Boxing. Hey, while you're here, before we get to this last one, go to www.86boxing.com and hit subscribe. There's going to be more stuff to pop up. Going to be doing some contests. I got some very good stuff that is coming up. And you'll get to stay in the know right there as far as what's going on. But if you can, go to there right now, subscribe. www.86boxing.com. I'm not going to overburden you, overwhelm you, or anything of that nature, but I'll get with everyone. Hey, you can be entered into a contest to win pretty special thing I've got coming up, and I'll just keep that under wraps there for sure. But now the last name, of course, probably the biggest name there as far as on this list, random, as I mentioned in the video, and one of the most polarizing figures in the history of the sport of boxing, of course, none other than the Galveston Giant himself, Jack Johnson. And really not a ton that I need to say, because I'm sure that everyone listening, or maybe everyone in here right now, and of course everyone listening, they know who Jack Johnson is. Now, Jack Johnson and Sam Langford fought when Langford was a middleweight at the time. Johnson was at heavyweight. So he had a weight advantage over him. Langford was 150, I want to say 6 or somewhere around there. And Jack Johnson was about 185. So he wasn't like a huge heavyweight in the sense of just overall weight. But that being said, he was competing at heavyweight at that particular period. And Sam Langford, he took that challenge and gave him a very, very competitive fight. Now, Jack Johnson did win the contest. With that being said, there's a reason Jack Johnson wanted no more to do with him. And I have a video on this channel, it's a little AI video where it's Jack Johnson speaking, but it's a real quote where he says, Sam Langford is the toughest SOB that ever lived. And pretty much he makes it clear that, hey, he wants nothing else to do with Sam Langford, especially the version of Sam Langford that was at heavyweight, which we most associate him with there, random. And I know you're all too familiar with that right there. So some people, I know there's someone on the channel, random, who was thinking that that Jack Johnson just easily handled Sam Langford when he was a middleweight and faced him, but that was not the case.
Yeah, well, in the fight itself, the best write-ups I found, well, I guess I'll explain how the fight came about. So Langford, on Christmas Day 1905, Langford had lost to Joe Jeanette, who was a common opponent, him and Johnson. And Jeanette stopped him in the eighth. The sponge went in. After that fight, Langford and his people and his manager claimed that the ref was allowing Jeanette to use his elbows, and that's what had cut him in, I think it was the seventh round. And so he left the ring in disgust. He wasn't actually ceding that he had been bested. Whether or not that was true, they were trying to get the rematch with Jeanette. The initial fight happened in Lawrence, Christmas Day, Lawrence, Massachusetts. So the first fight Langford had the next year in 1906 was against Larry Temple, who we mentioned earlier, beat Langford in 1905. Well, in one of their fights, this was at the Lincoln Athletic Club in Chelsea, Massachusetts, adjacent to Boston, which is where Langford would fight Johnson, a couple months later. So he stopped Larry Temple in the 15th round of the Lincoln Club. The Lincoln Club was trying to match Langford with George Gardner of Lowell, Massachusetts, who had lost the light heavyweight championship to Bob Fitzsimmons in 03. But Gardner drew the color line on Langford. So he ended up, after a quick win over Black Fitzsimmons in, where was that? The Lakeside AC. I can't remember the name of the town, but in Massachusetts. But April 5th, Langford and Jeanette rematched, and this was at the Lincoln Athletic Club. So he was back again a month later at the Lincoln. This time he beat Jeanette on points over 15 rounds. This was a big feather in his cap. And almost immediately afterwards, within days, he was matched with Johnson for the 26th. They fought 15 rounds again at the Lincoln. So this was Langford's third fight at the Lincoln Athletic Club that same year. And Johnson hammered him. He knocked him down in the sixth round. But the report I saw said that by the end of the sixth, Johnson wasn't in too good a shape because I think he had gotten a little bit tired. And that toward the end of the fight, in the final rounds, he looked very frustrated that he couldn't put Langford out. So at the end of the 15 rounds, Johnson obviously got the win because it was one-sided. Langford had one of his eyes closed, but he was cheered by the crowd for the pluck that he showed in defeat, amidst almost certain defeat, to just keep bringing it. And this was perhaps one of the reasons why later it was hard to get Johnson matched with Langford, because Langford, like I said earlier, was a very willing man, and he had a lot of attitude. He wasn't someone who would crumble. Now, I don't know if in the Jeanette fight, if he did give up, he apparently gave up about 20 pounds to Jeanette, and Jeanette was a superb fighter already, even though he would get even greater. So maybe the Christmas Day fight was a legit stoppage, but certainly in general, Langford had a reputation already as a very willing man, and he actually dropped Jeanette. I think it was in the fifth round in their first fight, the one that he lost. He actually dropped Jeanette, and he claimed the ref did a slow count and gave him 20 seconds to recover. I don't know if that's real either, but that's what they claimed, in the days following the fight. But anyway, he did get the win back from Jeanette. He got in there with Johnson. Now, we've talked about difficult fights to make. Johnson-Langford 2 was very, very difficult to make. I mean, they were offers from all over the world. But the first fight was surprisingly easy. They both just said yes immediately as soon as they heard word that the Lincoln wanted to match them. So, unfortunately, they didn't get in there again, but they did give the folks in Chelsea a heck of a fight, and Langford really showed that he was the most willing type of fighter. And, they were saying when he was fighting Jeanette and Johnson, they were saying, this is the kind of ability that's put him out of the class, of the men his size. So he was basically an open weight. By 1906, he was considered sort of an open weight freak, like some other guys had been. Fitzsimmons had been like that, where he was a middleweight, but he was fully capable of beating light heavyweights and heavyweights as a middleweight size fighter. And Langford was cut from that mold, from Joe Walcott, from Fitzsimmons. And the losing effort for Johnson actually increased his reputation. The fact that he got in there at all, but also that he tried his best, and he did stay the distance in spite of the fact that Johnson was considered one of the top heavyweights in the world. Like one of the top handful of guys in an open weight sense. Langford got in there willingly. He didn't win, but it did sort of kick off a rivalry that was unfulfilled as far as a rematch, but it did go on until 1915. It even passed when Johnson lost the white title that he had taken. There was still people wanted to see them fight. It just never happened. but it was an instance of two of the greatest of all time getting in there together. It's just that Langford was already in like what we would consider a prime. If he'd never gone up to heavyweight, you'd be like, wow, what a fighter he was in those days. But he would get even more dangerous. Whereas Johnson already had a full career by 1906, and then just went on to do more because Johnson was so brilliant. He was able to extend his sell by date, so to speak. You know, Johnson stayed really, really dangerous past the point when most guys, they physically couldn't hack it anymore. Johnson got bigger. Like you said, he was in the 180s in 1906, but when he fought Burns, he was in the 190s. And after that, he got up in the 200s. So Johnson did get bigger. He just wasn't then. So even though he had a big size advantage, it wasn't like he was 200 pounds doing this to Langford. He was in the 180s. He was the slimmer version of himself. But Johnson was a genius in the ring. And so even though he was more of a specialist at defense, he was capable of putting guys out when he wanted to. It's just, even when he tried to, he couldn't get Langford out of there. And I think it just left an impression on him as Langford put on more pounds and got even harder hitter, that maybe the calculation was that it wasn't worth it for similar money that he could get fighting guys who didn't have the technique. Johnson fought Ketchel, no problem, but Ketchel was a bit wilder than Langford. Langford was a real scientist in the ring. It's just that Ketchel hit remarkably hard. I mean, he dropped Johnson in that fight right before he got himself knocked out, but Ketchel was certainly a hard hitter, but Langford had the science and had the experience on another level because of those years back in light and welterweight where he'd fought some very, very good stylists, including great fighters. And I think that served Langford well as he got into the upper weights. He'd fought guys like Joe Gans, Dave Hawley, even like Larry Temple, young Peter Jackson, Barbados Walcott, Joe Walcott's brother Belfield Walcott, Patsy Sweeney out of New Hampshire, a very aggressive light/welterweight, a big name at the time. That was his second to last fight before the Gans fight. He beat Patsy Sweeney, then he beat Joe Reed of Lynn, who sort of had a regional reputation. Then he got the Gans fight. So he fought some guys, and I think that served him well, blocking and dodging when he was up against bigger men than himself, because he certainly didn't mind fighting larger guys. He might have even preferred it once he hit his prime, because they would be a little bit slower.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, hey, I wouldn't doubt it right there. I mean, just truly remarkable just when you think about it, and the fact that he went up against Johnson at that particular period in time. And Johnson, he has a pretty deep resume, as you saw by the depiction. I put up the sort of shot of his notable fights, which I'll bring up again. But before that, real quick, want to shout out to Scrapbook Boxing. There's two great minds at work. I appreciate the conversation. Appreciate you, Scrapbook Boxing. So
hey, did you see the picture of Pops hitting the bag that went up on Scrap's channel? That was cool, brother. I saw that. Yeah, he's got Wee Man up on the heavy bag.
All right, good stuff.
On his channel. Go check out Scrapbook's channel, people, if you don't already.
Yes, indeed. Highly recommend it right there. You want to learn about the history of the great sport right there. No better way to learn than Scrapbook Boxing. So appreciate you dropping by Scrapbook. Always an honor there for sure. Dan mentions, hey, great to see Scrapbook indeed. Mark says, Philadelphia Jack is a guy sparring Harry Greb in the video. Yes, indeed. That was him right there. And they were just kind of messing around there for the most part. Dan mentions, Dan agrees there. Shout out to Chris Irish Boxing. So salute there to you, Chris, representing Ireland, the great fighting town. We were talking about the great fighting country, rather. But we were talking about some of the great Irish fighters of the 1800s in the last episode, or the last live that we did on Boxing History Every Night. Shout out to Coy Lesone. Appreciate you there. Coy says great info on the sport of boxing. Appreciate you there. Thanks. Stick around. Be sure to subscribe, like 86 Boxing, Random Acoustic Thoughts right here. Talking Sam Langford there. Appreciate you there, buddy. First time seeing you in the mix here, but always great to have you.
Patsy Sweeney was Irish.
Oh,
him and his brother Peter, they boxed. Patsy was the more notable, but yeah, they're from Ireland. George Gardner was born in Ireland. And fun fact, so Langford, the second fight of 1910 that he had with Jim Flynn was on St. Patrick's Day, but Jim Flynn wasn't Irish. And the papers were joking that the Irish cognomen didn't help him that time. He was actually Italian. but he went under an Irish fighting name, and they were joking that the luck of the Irish didn't apply to the Italian.
That's funny. That is pretty funny. The luck of the Irish right there. So that's good stuff there. Chris mentions personally preferring Langford, maybe just his style of fighting. Oh, yes, indeed. That second matchup between him and Johnson would have been something super special there for sure. I wish we could have seen it. Scrapbook mentions, great to see you, Dan. Again, always a pleasure to have you here, Scrapbook. Of course, a steward of the history. If you want to know the history of the sport from a true historian, Scrapbook Boxing. Go subscribe to his channel right now if you haven't. If you don't know of it, Scrapbook Boxing. It's easy to type into the chat.
He's in a class of his own, and I got to give a special shout to Scrap, because between him and the boxing librarian, they're the guys who kind of inspired me to start actually researching, and now I'm actually writing a book on Langford's early career. But this stems from the enthusiasm that I got from listening to Scrap and the boxing librarian talk about the history, and then obviously 86, you've been doing some incredible work, and that's further inspired me to just try and put something out, although I'm doing it in the written word, which is, by the way, why I haven't had a lot of stuff on my channel. When I start to get tempted, I go, you need to write some chapters here, brother. So, and I burrow back down into the project, but I'm hoping maybe within a year from now, I'll have my book out on Langford. It's going to deal with this 1902 to 1908. It's going to start from the amateur tournament at the Roanoke Club in 1902, and it's going to end with his knockout of fireman Jim Flynn in California in December 1908, which is the same month that Jack Johnson defeated Tommy Burns to unify the white and colored heavyweight titles for the first time in the gloved era. Truly became undisputed. That's the scope of the book. It's more than half done. The first draft is more than half finished, so I'm excited about it. But shout out to you, Scrap, and thank you again, my friend, for inspiring me to get into the history as deep as I've tried to.
No doubt about it there. Good stuff indeed there. Shout out to Edith Fernandez. Appreciate you there, buddy. He said this is a great mix. A lot of history here, guys. Thanks a lot. Hey, appreciate you being here to share it. We get to dialogue together, all that good stuff. So it's most certainly appreciate it. Shout out to Bruce Gas, Boxing Jads, more doing the trivias on this show. I'm going to try to catch out the next one. Been searching for his answer. Is it true Jack Johnson and Harry Greb sparred? Any info? I don't know about that. I don't know that they did. You know, I heard anything about that there, Random?
No, I haven't, but that's not in the scope. I've only looked at Greb a little, but that's past the scope of my studies. I've researched Langford heavily up to about the end of 1911, but then that's when I started focusing back on his early career. So no, I can't speak to that, I'm afraid.
Oh yeah, good stuff there. Good question there, Blake. Yeah, I know from what I've searched and all that stuff, I haven't run across that. What I've researched, I haven't run across Greb and Langford actually sparring. I'm going to look into it, but I haven't necessarily looked into it because I never associated the two as far as potentially or even remotely.
Wait, did he ask Greb and Langford or Greb and Johnson? I haven't heard of either, by the way.
Greb and Johnson.
Okay.
Yeah, Greb and Jack Johnson. So I never associated the two with each other, primarily because, of course, Greb started out at such a lower weight, and Johnson was his career started, I believe, 1913. So Johnson was well into his heavyweight career, over 200 pounds, I'd imagine, at that particular time. And that's one of the reasons why. So I never even searched the two of them being linked together. I'm going to look into it there, Blake. That was a good question there, though. But yeah, I don't recall anything out of it. So appreciate you there, Random, in terms of the relation to that. So everybody understands Scrapbook, baby. Mac Bergeron says Dempsey and Greb did spar. That I know. Read it, of course, but Jack Johnson, I don't know. Yeah, same here. And the Dempsey Greb sparring was on the same day where I think there's some video of a guy who was I believe he was a Hispanic fighter or heavyweight. I can't think of his name. We just don't have any footage of Dempsey Greb, but it would have been a hell of a one to see, though. Scrapbook says Battling Siki lost to Irish Mike Mateague. Oh yeah. Oh yes, indeed. There, Battling Siki, first African world champion, former world light heavyweight champion, beat George Carpentier. Indeed. Yeah, that would have been crazy. Shout out to Bruce Gas, Boxing Jazz, and more. Says salute. So appreciate you there, Bruce. Says salute to myself and Random, of course. Hey, appreciate you there, Bruce. Hey, be sure to go check him out, folks. Bruce does some trivia over there, touching on the history as well as some other stuff, just showing some different historic fights and all of that stuff in general right there. So he's attuned to what went down here in the past and all that stuff. So appreciate you there.
Yeah, shout out,
No
Bruce.
doubt.
Great content there. Also, just briefly, if I can mention 86, we mentioned Frank Klaus. Well, the Boxing Librarian recently did a video going through Frank Klaus's career. That's definitely one worth seeing there, because he did have a pretty tough career by today's standards, even if by the standards of the day there were more gigantic careers floating around. But he did quite a lot, that guy.
Oh yeah, Frank Klaus, yeah, world middleweight champion right there, hell of a fighter, as mentioned. Yeah, not an extensive, especially in terms of quantity of fights, but one of those guys that is certainly worth checking out there. And hey, the history is littered with individuals of this nature. Real quick, just to close the loop on Jack Johnson, who needs no introduction, of course. Some of the names on there, of course, the likes of, Sam McVeigh could have been heavyweight champion. Joe Jeanette, same. Denver Ed Martin, there's a video on the channel of Denver Ed Martin, same as there's a video on Sam McVeigh on the channel as well. There's a video on Joe Butler, the king of the middleweights, who fought at heavyweight as well. Worth checking out. Of course, Jack Johnson lost his title to Jess Willard. And there's a video on the channel on Jess Willard, as a matter of fact. It's one of the older videos or whatnot, but certainly worth checking out. Understanding Jess Willard, a rival that of Fred Fulton. Frank Moran, contender from that time, actually fought for the world heavyweight title, had a draw, and I've seen some records of a loss to Jess Willard, but hey, it depends on what source you look at. You can read it. Joe Chawinski, he knocked out Jack Johnson. They were locked up together for about 30, 31 days, somewhere in that range, trained together. There's some pictures out there, and they became friends. And Joe Chawinski shared a lot of good information with Jack Johnson that proved to be beneficial as Jack Johnson proceeded with his career. Battling Jim Johnson, wanted to mention to him. So Jack Johnson did put the world heavyweight title on the line against a black fighter, and it was battling Jim Johnson during his heavyweight reign. But of course, him and battling Jim Johnson were no strangers to each other, so he was able to defeat him. Hank Griffin, another one of those heavyweights who doesn't have a prominent name, certainly in these particular times, but he was a formidable force there during this period. He actually fought Jim Jeffries as well. Hank Griffin, there's a video on the channel on him. It's worth checking out. Same as the case with Frank Childs, the first two-time world colored heavyweight champion. I mentioned him, as well as George Gardner, Bob Fitzsimmons. You know, of course, Stanley Ketchel, the fireman Jim Flynn. But Johnson has a hell of a resume as well. Now, during his title reign, of course, we always mentioned that there were some fights or things that were left to be desired in some sense, but just from a resume overall, man, hell of a fighter there for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also worth mentioning, you know, like, though he didn't fight during the world title reign, didn't fight, you know, Jeanette McVeigh or Langford and some other guys, but, you know, the guys he was fighting, Al Kaufman, Frank Moran, even battling Jim, but like fireman Jim Flynn was on a streak. He had lost to Langford, but then he went on it was like an 8 or 9 fight win streak before he fought Johnson, contended for the title. So like Johnson wasn't fighting weak fighters. He just wasn't fighting some of his fellow greats. And there was a thirst for those fights because of how great they were and they were in their primes. So it's complicated with Johnson. Great overall resume, long colored title reign from 1903 till, you know, 1908 or 1909 when he stopped defending it. World title from formerly white, world title from the end of 08 through 15. I mean, this was a great fighter. Very few defeats in that time. Even the loss to Marvin Hart was a close one. And like you'd referenced, you know, Marvin Hart's aggression, he was an aggressive fighter. His aggression offset Johnson's defensive brilliance, and he got the award. And it's just how it goes sometimes. If you play on the counter, even if you're really good at it, the judges, or in this case, the ref, who is the judge, some of them really counted aggression. They liked that come forward. They liked the guy who was leading. And so it cost Johnson in that fight. But overall, just a remarkably great resume and one of the great stylists of the early era for any size fighter. Johnson was a heavyweight, but he was brilliant for any size fighter. He was really that good. Really hard to tag him clean and to pressure him because he knew how to, especially those little uppercuts, he knew how to tie a guy up. He knew how to punish them coming in, and while they were still in there, he knew how to make them sorry for being so. But yeah, he does. Sometimes people write off his championship reign like he did nothing but fight, soft serve, easy wins. That's not entirely fair. Like after he beat Tommy Burns, it was actually surprisingly, it was actually Stanley Ketchel and Sam Langford were the two main guys that I see in the press. They were talking about might be the ones to turn the trick against Johnson. Even though they were middleweights, the public seemed to think, and a lot of the sports seemed to think that they were the guys who might actually have the solution to Johnson. So fighting smaller guys doesn't always mean you're fighting someone who people don't respect. Jack O'Brien was a guy like that. He fought above his weight, and people had to respect the skills because he had shown that he could beat people larger than himself. So it's not always easy, even if it's easier. And I think that's the story of Johnson's, the later part of his career. He wasn't fighting like Al Kaufman. There was a lot of hype behind him. Frank Moran wasn't a scrub, so he was fighting some tough guys. So I just wanted to give him that bit of respect because the meme about him is, he didn't fight anyone once he beat Tommy Burns. That's not true. Jim Flynn beat some tough guys to get into a position. Even if Langford was maybe more worthy and had beaten Flynn, Flynn had done his own body of work since the loss in March to Langford to get into that position, a year or whatever it was later. So it's complicated. Just like today, it gets complicated. You can't write guys off entirely. Johnson got in there.
Yeah, no doubt about it there. Hey, that's the story of boxing right there, and certainly a great history. Shout out to the Ron Lau mentions. Of course, Lau Foreman, hell of a fight for sure there. And overall, man, just some great fighters there on the resume of Langford. We dove into a good bit of it, and more to come for sure as far as those overall conversations. But with that, of course, been about 2 hours, over 2 hours here a little bit. But that being said, a lot of good discussion, a lot of good content that we were able to get through there. And of course, it could go on and on, especially when you're talking about a guy like Sam Langford and the names we didn't even mention. Maybe that's something we can set up at a later time there. But certainly, we appreciate everyone who dropped by to show us some love here while we were going through this process of discussing these great fighters there. As mentioned, be sure to check out Random Acoustic Thoughts. He has a channel here on YouTube. If you just look up Random Acoustic Thoughts, you're going to see it. And you're going to see stuff about Sam Langford as well as some of the other top heavyweights, some of the names we didn't even really dive into or get to tonight because we were just focusing on those world champions or those that had world titles when he in or around when he faced them or whatever, or had them at some point in their careers. But trust me, his resume gets even deeper and deeper, and maybe we'll set up something for that. But that being said, man, we appreciate everyone who dropped by here to show us some love here. And Random, hey, I thank you for dropping by as well, buddy.
Thanks for having me on 86. It's always a pleasure talking to you, my friend.
No doubt about it. But again, hey, be sure to like and subscribe to everyone in the mix here. Thank you all for joining up. We will be back here next week. I'm going to be chatting with my buddy, my best friend there, Jeremy Smith. We're going to talk about a little photography, the boxing and history aspect tied to it, of course. So stick around for that for sure. And in the meantime, hey, check everyone out. And salute to you all. Thank you all for everything that you do and creating this great dialogue. The history lives on, baby. So salute to you all and have